Now this era of logging to sustain the family farm continued, in some cases, continued through the end of the 1800s. But beginning about the 1830s, 1840s, we started seeing a more industrialized approach to the process of logging. Certainly by the 1850s and 60s we saw this change. Several factors took place. First, we had for the first time large capitalist investments taking place. And by that I mean this. You had several individuals collect their money and buy huge, enormous tracts of land in rural Pennsylvania, the northern tier especially, up the west branch of the Susquehanna. And what they would do is purchase thousands of acres, and they would go in, cut all the pine in the early days is all they bothered with, and then raft it down the river. All the while, it's done as an investment. So you're paying men to go out and do the cutting. You're paying men to navigate the rafts, and you're all the while keeping track and trying to make sure that by the time it gets to market, which in those days down the Susquehanna, the market was not Williamsport, it was Marietta, Lancaster County, because there you could load it into the Tidewater Canal and either sell it inland like Lancaster County, or you could continue it all the way down to Baltimore and areas down there where they had shipyards and whatnot. But all the while you're thinking, if I can get enough money per board foot of pine, I'll be able to pay off my loggers, pay off my rafters, and so forth. But it was done for the first time as an investment, as a way of making capital for a business. And that is different than the way the colonial farmers approached the industry. It was much more sustainable when a family farmer was simply cutting some of his own personal acreage to make a little bit of supplemental income in the spring. The other big change that took place in the 1860s was the massive advancement of the railroad. Trains and rails had been seen decades earlier. By the 1820s and 30s and 40s, there were some railroads existing in Pennsylvania. But in the 1860s and into the 70s, we saw logging railroads just take off like wildfire. The logging rail engine, known as the Shay locomotive, actually gave logging companies the ability to go up extremely steep grades. And since much of rural forested Pennsylvania at the time was up on top of the Allegheny Plateau and up some very steep hollers and whatnot, you needed a locomotive that could go up real steep grades.
I work on the mountain, cutting the timber. I work till my fingers are sore, cutting the timber that goes through the sawmill that builds another honky-tonk floor.
What else took place during that time period? The introduction of the cross-cut saw. Now the cross-cut saw allowed two men to cut the back half through the tree, through the stump, much faster than the traditional method, which was with an axe. So they still did their face cut. They still did their face cut, which is like a wedge with the axe, but then they'd come from the back with the cross-cut saw. Much faster, and the railroads allowed them to do this 12 months of the year. No longer could you only do this in the spring. Now, some other changes that were taking place in the market. We started seeing a demand for mine props. Keep in mind, Pennsylvania at the time was an enormous producer of coal, both soft coal in western Pennsylvania and southern Pennsylvania, but anthracite coal in the east. And you needed mine timbers, props to hold up the roof. You also needed all kinds of lumber, hardwood lumber, to build the batteries and different wall structures down inside the mine. And it was an enormous amount of lumber that the coal mining industry consumed. So you started seeing some of those investors that I talked about, some of those lumber capitalists that were investing in lumberlands. They also, in many cases, had coal interests. So many times coal mining operators, coal company owners, cut out the middleman by buying their own several thousand acre lumber yacht. A good example would be the Culp family from Culpmont near Mount Carmel. The Culps, they were lumbermen. And they were providing their own lumber for their mines, which really helped cut costs by cutting out the middleman. So now hardwood's being cut for the props. Hardwood's being cut for the mine boards. And places that had been logged for white pine were now being revisited because the white pine had been cleared out, but now they're going back for all that hardwood. Another big change took place. In the late 1800s, the hemlock tree started becoming very valuable for a source for tannic acid. In the late 1800s, another industry was booming, and that was the industry of tanning. Taking animal hides, tanning them in tannic acid, and producing leather. Leather was valuable for belts in factories where you had flywheels driving belts. It was leather that held wagons and harnesses together. And the way you processed tannic acid was using a bark spud and peeling the bark of the hemlock tree, our state tree, the eastern hemlock. The hemlock was stripped of its bark. The bark was then stacked in piles to dry and then shipped out later. Now, the irony of the tanning industry is that in many cases, the hides that they were tanning in Pennsylvania in the mid and late 1800s were the hides of buffalo shot out in the plains. And in many cases, the buffalo were shot strictly for their hides, stripped of their hides, and the bodies were left there totally in waste. And ironically, here in Pennsylvania, in the early part of the tanning industry, the same thing took place with the hemlock tree. Hemlock lumber was not very valuable at the time. White pine was the desired lumber. So if the hemlock tree was felled far away from anywhere that it could easily be sawed, it really wasn't worth the trouble to get it out. So all they did is strip the hemlock bark and they left the lumber there to rot. This took place through into the early 1900s until eventually the forest had been depleted quite a bit. There were places where, as far as the eye could see, it was nothing but stumps. The chemical industry came in and they cut down trees as small around as this handle, this tool handle. And that was for the chemical, cellulose, wood alcohol, all the different chemicals that can be made by breaking down and processing wood. It really didn't matter what size the wood was. So now you had a market for literally every single tree in the forest. And therefore companies would go in and simply take everything. Far different than what we had seen earlier in the colonial time period, where they only took what they needed for the farm and a little bit extra to make some extra money. Now this would have continued, I'm convinced this would have continued forever, but it couldn't. The resource could only last as long as there were trees in the forest. And the cutting rate was unbelievable. By the 1920s, it was hard to find a white-tailed deer in Pennsylvania simply because their ecosystem was gone. And that gives you an idea of how bad it really got. And in fact, most of the forest that we have today here in Pennsylvania, if you age the trees, you'll see much of our forest is approximately 80 to 100 years old. And that's exactly because that's when the forest had been cleared and it's finally had a chance to grow back. Okay, when you're out in the woods and you find a stump that's about waist high, even though it's pretty well rotten, that's an indication that you're looking at a stump from the days of logging pre-chainsaw. So this would have been pre-1950s. This stump could easily be from the 1930s or 1920s. And the reason being, if this tree was felled by hand using axes or crosscut saws, the loggers, as you can see in many of the old photographs, they did it where it was convenient, which was about waist high. So again, when you find waist high stumps, you're looking at a stump, the remnants of a logging job from a bygone era. Now the straightest of the white pines, the ones that were absolutely perfect specimens, well over 100 feet tall, very straight, very big around, they would have actually been sold for what's called a spar. Now spars were the things that held up the mast on a sailing vessel. Now you have to remember, before the invention of engines and steam power, it was wind power that powered people around on the world's oceans. So you needed a strong pole to hold up that sail that would keep that sailing vessel moving. White pine was exactly that thing, and it was called a spar. Now another change that was taking place in the industrial time period was the introduction of a device called a boom on the river, a boom. And what you have happen is these large timber operators that were purchasing thousands of acres and cutting thousands and thousands of feet of white pine, in many cases they wouldn't even bother rafting it to market. And if they were close enough to water, they many times wouldn't even bother with the railroad. Instead what they would do, they'd take their logs close to the water, they'd put the company stamp on the end of the log. One good swift whack with this and it puts the company brand, in this case X11. And somewhere on file, X11 correlates to a certain company. So now that your log is marked, the log will be rolled into the river or rolled into the creek, and eventually thousands and thousands of other logs with it would go downriver. And the premier lumber town in the mid and late 1800s, of course, was Williamsport, Pennsylvania. So all these floating logs, loose floating logs, come down, and what stops them is a boom. So as the